Her Majesty's Ambassador Mr. Matthew Lodge, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to this event. I am Konstantina Botsiou, General Director at the Council for International Relations, Greece, and Professor of History and International Relations. This is the second discussion we organize as part of the new Council's initiative called the Ambassadors Forum. The forum was inaugurated about 2 months ago by a discussion with the US Ambassador to Greece, Mr. Jeffrey Pyatt. Tonight, we are profoundly honored and thrilled to present the Ambassador of the United Kingdom to the Hellenic Republic, Mr. Matthew Lodge. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for accepting our invitation in a very, very busy schedule, as we understand. The honor is even greater since this is one of your first public appearances in Greece, where you assumed your appointment only recently. So we cordially wish you a wonderful and very productive term. Not only does Ambassador Lodge hold a highly important post as the British Ambassador to Greece, but he's also a great friend of the Greeks and has close family ties with this country. His wife is Greek, and as he pointed out in his inaugural address in September 2021, coming to Greece feels like coming home. Let me briefly introduce our keynote speaker, as it would take a lot of time to read his impressive CV. Before coming to Greece, Ambassador Lodge served as Her Majesty's Ambassador to Finland between 2010 and 2013, at the height of the Greek crisis in the Eurozone, actually. Then he moved to the Middle East to a crucial post near the line of fire, Kuwait, between 2014 and 2017. After those 2 terms, he returned to Europe to serve as minister at the British Embassy in Paris for 4 years, 2017 to 2021. And at the same time, he served as ambassador and permanent delegate to UNESCO. Mr. Lodge has been working in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office since 1996, and at difficult times he's been in the Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean, in posts like Georgia and Armenia, in Athens, 1998 to 2000, during the Kosovo War actually, in Baghdad and Afghanistan. He holds a BA in modern languages, French and Russian, and he served in the Royal Marines, among other places in the United States and Norway. After the keynote speech, we're expecting a lively and rewarding Q&A session with 3 outstanding colleagues, Mr. Christos Hadjiemmanuil, Professor of International and European Financial Institutions at the University of Piraeus, Mr. Petros Liakouras, Professor of International Law at the University of Piraeus, and Mr. Yannis Tivachtis, Professor of Political Science and International Relations and Jean Monnet Chair at the Virginia Tech University in the United States. To save time, instead of reading their amazing CVs, I limit myself only to the presentation of their main academic affiliation. Now let's start with the keynote speaker and then discussion will follow. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much again. We're looking forward to listening to you. The floor is yours.
Professor Botsiou and distinguished professors in the Ambassadors Forum, it's a great pleasure to be invited to join you here tonight. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. As you said, Professor, I've been in Athens this time for just 3 months. I arrived at the end of August, straight from Paris. And like many of us, I think, moving into new positions in the last 18 months, arrive in a city with a pandemic still present, but very much from my point of view, welcoming the opportunity to come somewhere that feels like home, with many familiar faces and friends, and much that is new alongside much that I remember and cherish from my previous posting. What I'd like to do, if I may, in setting out my opening remarks here, is just reflect on some of those initial experiences, but also how over the time that I was preparing to arrive and over the 3 months, a busy 3 months that I've been able to enjoy since I started, we are seeing a very interesting set of developments and evolutions in the region, in the wider world, and also, of course, in the relationship between the United Kingdom and the Hellenic Republic. If I reflect back, as I was finishing up in Paris and preparing to come here earlier this summer, my discussions with my predecessor, of course, focused in large part on the importance of this bicentenary year for Greece, and also for all of those countries, Great Britain, England, the United Kingdom included, who had played a role 200 years ago in helping support that struggle for independence and the eventual realization of that objective. So that has been both a constant feature of my preparations, but also I'm very pleased to say a consistent thread of much of what I have been able to do in my first few months. But if that was a historical reminder of the connections between the United Kingdom and the Hellenic Republic, when I actually arrived, there was something much more contemporary and perhaps even more sort of forward-looking. And I'm talking about the very difficult period of the forest fires in Evia and Attiki in August. And the issues that those raised, not just for the Greek population, but for communities across much of the Eastern Mediterranean region, but simultaneously problems in North America and elsewhere, which served as a very important and timely, if very difficult reminder, I think, of some of the other challenges that we've been looking forward to this autumn, and where we find ourselves having to work together to address some really huge global issues. And I'll say a little bit more about Glasgow and the COP26 talks in a moment. Another feature which struck me again on my arrival, and I shouldn't be surprised by this, but bearing in mind, as you said, I was here between 98 and 2000 last time, was the sense that within an Eastern Mediterranean where the United Kingdom has historic alliances and friendships and historic responsibilities, and I'm thinking obviously there about Cyprus and our role as a guarantor power, but also many friends and partners and allies, not only in the European Union, but in Europe, but also through NATO, was the sense of continuing and in some ways rather heightened tension and difficulty in the relationship between Greece and Turkey, and a strong thread within that of migratory pressures that had peaked most recently, perhaps 2-3 years ago, but have been a constant feature of the geopolitics within the region for the last 5 years or so. And reflecting, having come from France, how those migratory pressures were impacting on our relationships and the way that we work together with a whole host of European countries and partners. And it was clear that that was going to be a steady feature, and I fear it will be a feature looking forward. Another initial observation, however, was the sense of optimism and dynamism. And I say this coming from the UK with 6-7 months into our post-European Union future, with a government that is confident and determined in setting a positive path for the United Kingdom. But actually finding, even if I had been visiting regularly, that coming back to Greece and coming specifically back to Athens, the talk of the town, many of those who I first met, reflected a sense that for Greece, and you referred, Professor Botsou, to the economic crisis, but for Greece, whatever the current difficulties, this year, in many ways, is a period of casting off the shadow of the economic crisis. And there's a huge amount of hope and optimism, I think, around the recovery and resilience funding and about the government's plans for the future. And again, I'd like to come back to that a little bit in a moment. So what does that mean for a newly arrived ambassador inheriting the important mantle of a key relationship with a long-standing partner? And of course, our partnership goes back much more than 200 years. Well, in many ways, I think the initial challenge and responsibility is, as every ambassador finds, to make sure that you are getting under the skin of the local community, that you're getting out, you're hearing, you're learning, you're able to challenge those initial assumptions that you may have had, to confirm the ones that are valid, and to put aside the ones that may need to be updated. From a British point of view, it is undoubtedly true that we are going through a period of change and adjustment. That is, of course, most obvious in many ways as a result of the decision to leave the European Union and the focus of our government on what I would describe as a set of strategic goals and ambitions across a genuinely global canvas. It is not, despite what many in the media might have you to believe, or indeed British domestic politics, I think sometimes has suggested, a rejection of something. It is more a positive move towards embracing new opportunities and wider horizons. But it does mean that for those of us working in the context of our relationship with our established European partners in the European neighborhood, that there is a particular challenge and responsibility to take those relationships forward, whilst perhaps political attention and much of the media focus that follows that goes elsewhere. And we've done that, and I acknowledge the support and engagement of the Greek government in this, I think very comprehensively, and I hope very effectively, over the last 3 months. I was delighted that on the back of a visit by our Home Secretary in June, and establishing a close relationship with Minister Mitarakis to understand how Greece and the United Kingdom are handling the migration challenges, that we actually saw a situation where British firefighters were able to come in August to help what became quite an international effort in support of the Greek authorities at that time. Even in areas where we understand that there are differences and we aren't following the same path. We've had Minister Petritis in London talking to Lord Frost so that we can understand respective positions on the key European issues of the moment. And we'll inevitably come back to that, I'm sure, in questions and otherwise. We've been able and very pleased to welcome Minister Kikilias to London for the World Travel Markets meetings. And he has come back with further affirmation of strong connections and strong appetites from British tourists and British carriers to continue to support the Greek tourism sector at the end of what I think has been a much more positive year than many had feared, and certainly more positive than last year with the pandemic. And of course, we have seen Minister Dendias on the 25th of October in London with the Foreign Secretary and with Minister Morton, signing a new strategic bilateral framework document, a memorandum of understanding which runs to some sort of 4 or 5 pages I've got here, but essentially sets out a roadmap for UK-Greek relations in this period ahead of us, now that the United Kingdom has left the European Union, but recognizing that whether it is on, and I'm reading some of the headings, on foreign and regional policy, on defense cooperation, trade and investment, digitalization, tourism, maritime affairs, health, education, research, innovation and culture, law enforcement, migration, climate change, and the wider cooperation, whether there is scope for us to further strengthen an already remarkably broad and positive set of engagement and partnership. And we've had then, of course, as I alluded earlier on, the COP26 meetings in Glasgow in the first 10 days of November. Prime Minister Mitsotakis there giving a keynote speech along with other world leaders and other ministers, including Minister Karameas, up in Glasgow, meeting with UK higher education institutions, University of Edinburgh, University of Glasgow, and the Secretary of State for Education. So both in multilateral fora and bilaterally, we've had a busy few months. And I came back just last week from Prime Minister Mitsotakis' meeting with Prime Minister Johnson in London on the 16th, where it's the first time actually the two prime ministers since they respectively taken up office have had a substantive meeting of this sort. And the breadth of those discussions, I think again reminds us of the state of the relationship and the potential for what we can achieve. Let me say a little bit more about the UK position, though, because I think it's important that that is understood. I mentioned earlier on about our historic and continuing responsibilities in this part of the world, not just as a friend and ally of Greece, as a NATO ally, as a guarantor power in Cyprus, but also engagement, and you referenced, Professor, the conflict in the Balkans and the UK role there. But the UK government's stance is unapologetically positive, proactive, and global in its ambitions. As I say, this has not been in any way not intended as a rejection of anything else, but it is, as was set out in the integrated review, the document that the government published earlier this year, described as Global Britain in a Competitive Age, an integrated review not only of security and defence policy, but also development and foreign policy issues. That sets out a very clear roadmap for the current government and for the United Kingdom for the period ahead. And even if there is a particular focus on countering threats, emerging threats from hostile actors, even if there is a clear acknowledgement of the changing nature of the global economy, the importance of digitalization and cyber, even of course with our chairing the climate change talks, there's a very strong and central theme about climate change and environmental protection and biodiversity. There is also a thread which runs through it, which is about partnership, and it is about multilateralism. Now, the word multilateralism is maybe not presented in that particular form as much as one might have expected. But the Foreign Secretary has been very clear in her early statements since she took office that what she is determined to do is to build security and economic ties and alliances in order to create what she describes as a network of liberty around the world. Now that's a powerful expression. We now, as public servants supporting our ministers and our government, need to get on and do that. But it is, as I've said before, it is explicitly about extending and expanding our alliances and our partnerships, but recognizing that at the heart of that remains our position as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, our role within the G7, but also our membership of the NATO alliance, our position as a European nation, even if we're no longer within the European Union. And interestingly, I'd observe closer partnerships with a number of those countries, and I'm thinking here about Israel and many of the Gulf states, but also others like South Korea and so on, with whom the Greek government has also been strengthening its own ties in recent times. So, professors, ladies and gentlemen, from the point of view of a British ambassador arrived recently in Athens, I'm clear that I have an important responsibility to build on the historic friendship and partnership that we enjoy, and I'm confident will continue to enjoy, to make sure that we are adapting to the changed circumstances within our European neighbourhood, and that for the UK is the democratically mandated decision for us to leave the European Union, which finally took effect at the end of December last year, and to make sure that we are pursuing with Greece those areas of partnership and cooperation, whether it's on regional security, whether it's as NATO allies, whether it's as champions of climate change and tackling climate change and supporting the environment and promoting biodiversity, but also some of those more explicitly bilateral interests, if you like, strengthening the educational, maintaining the educational ties that we have, ensuring that our economies support one another, that British tourists continue to come here, working together to confront emerging threats. The global pandemic is an obvious one. And I'm positive and confident that we have, through the exchanges we've seen this autumn, through the bilateral framework that has been signed, a canvas on which we can now build and paint. But we've got a lot of work to do. I'm not going to pretend that we haven't. But I think there's every reason, as the Foreign Secretary would say, to be positive, confident and proactive about how we go about doing that. I will leave it there, Professor, if I may, as an introduction. I hope that is helpful, and I will be delighted to answer any questions that anybody wants to put to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for this comprehensive overview of global British politics and of its regional responsibilities. As a historian, I could not agree more with you that British-Greek ties are very old and very strong, and that Britain has contributed a lot to Greece's independence and national integration. But let me use the advantage of the chair before giving the word to the distinguished professors of the panel, in order to move us again back to the global and regional equation, and asking you how the AUKUS alliance, namely the pact that was recently signed between Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States, could perhaps offer new opportunities for strategically positioned countries in the Eastern Mediterranean, like Greece and Cyprus, instead of generating a fear that the US or the United Kingdom might abandon European defense. It could also be a window of opportunity for such countries in order to find their own position in the new reshuffling of defense arrangements around the world.
Thank you, Professor. And I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with your with the thrust of your question, which is, I think, speaking candidly, the immediate and quite swift reaction to that announcement of the AUKUS alliance was not exactly, I think, as was expected in a number of capitals. But as we have been at pains to explain at the time and continue to do so, that decision, that alliance that the United Kingdom signed up to along with Australia and the United States is intended to be complementary to existing defense partnerships and alliances. Obviously, from a United Kingdom perspective, we have an incredibly close relationship with Australia. We share a monarch, we share a membership of the Commonwealth, and much more besides. For the United States, particularly in the Pacific, the connections with Australia have been very strong and growing stronger over recent years. And between the US and the United Kingdom, of course, there has been a long-standing defense and security partnership, incredibly deep one, since the end of the Second World War, including in sharing of technology around our nuclear deterrent and so on. So the reaction, and I don't want to get into what you might call some of the more sort of national or domestic politics the reaction. But I think the reaction was unfortunate and was misplaced. And it may well be that there were other factors beyond the pure sort of calculation of defense alliances and interests. AUKUS was created to respond to an increasing sense of threat and challenge for values and principles that we as European nations and North Atlantic allies, but also Australia included, hold dear. The principles of free movement, free navigation of the seas, democracy, human rights, free trade. So in that respect, it is and should be seen as entirely consistent with the partnership and the principles of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and indeed of the European Union and European Union defense. So I think the answer, I would say, to your point about whether it gives an opportunity for Greece or Cyprus in the Eastern Mediterranean, I think it undoubtedly does, and that is for Greece and the Republic of Cyprus to decide how you want to respond to that. But I think it is much more positive than it should be seen as threatening or destabilizing. And I think it is a very clear reflection of an assessment about the changing nature of geopolitics. And it's very easy to say, and as academics, I'm sure you'll drill me sort of rigorously on this, but in many ways, it reminds us that the world is becoming an increasingly interconnected and a smaller place, but it also, unfortunately, reminds us that the threats are currently increasing, not diminishing. And so alliances, flexible alliances, will be, I think, a feature of the coming years and something that we should welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for your answer. Now let us open the Q&A session with the panelists, and I will start with Professor Christos Hadjimanuil for his first question. Professor Hadjimanuil.
Thank you so much. Ambassador, I would like to come closer to home from the Pacific to Europe and Brexit in particular. You appreciate that this is a significant issue for all Europeans and a matter of great interest in the debates. So as I see it, since the signing of the withdrawal agreement, the government of the United Kingdom has approached its relationship with its European partners in a rather aggressive and uncompromising manner. I'm thinking about a number of issues which offer good examples. In relation to AUKUS, for instance, there was the snubbing of France. Of course, it was not mainly of the UK's doing, and we have discussed that. But again, here in Europe, one thinks of Northern Ireland and your threatened triggering of Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol. One also thinks about the dispute with France on fishing rights, the issue of illegal immigrants crossing the Channel, and so on. It seems to me as if the UK would like to reinforce symbolically its vision of a powerful, buccaneering global Britain. You personally referred to the global Britain a few minutes ago. How, through a conspicuous display of disregard, if not disdain, for European sensibilities and basic interests, as if it would, the UK would like to show to everybody how superior it is. I'm not sure about the wisdom of this approach as a negotiating tactic. For instance, Lord Frost is following hard-boiled negotiation tactics on the Northern Ireland matter, which may be premised on the mistaken assumption that the EU lacks the resolve or unity to fight its corner, and that the UK can renege on a commitment signed only 1 year ago with impunity. But what are the practical effects of triggering Article 16? and then assuming that we Europeans are soft people, feeble, divided, and that this view is absolutely correct. Are there still no longer-term consequences? How would this approach help maintain your soft power as a major international force? How does it support your public diplomacy? How is it compatible with the need? Because I do not doubt that this is a need and a strategic interest for the UK to pursue deep and mutually beneficial relationship with its European neighbours.
Thank you, Professor. There's a lot in there, so let me try and sort of unpack it, if I may. But I think I would start by saying that I'm sorry if the way you frame the question is an expression of the impression, the opinion that you have formed about the British government's stance and the underlying motivations behind it. And it is, you talk about whether it's aggressive and uncompromising. That is not and it has not been the intention of Lord Frost or British government ministers. But let me go back, and because having spent 4 years in Paris, the 4 years of the Brexit process prior to our departure in Paris, and now finding myself here, I hope I can offer some useful sort of explanation or clarification. I think the first thing that it is important to acknowledge is that whatever, and I'm a public servant, so I have to remain apolitical about this, but whatever one's personal views about the decision that the United Kingdom took to leave the European Union, that was on the basis of a referendum and a clear democratic mandate. And whether it was the Theresa May government or now Prime Minister Johnson's government, that was what they were determined to deliver. And we've heard them at repeated occasions explain that is, that sovereignty and that decision by British voters was what was driving them to do so. Now, if one remembers that and parks it, I think the complexity of extricating ourselves, the United Kingdom, from effectively a sort of 47-year relationship, which even if we were never a subscriber to ever closer union, we've seen over the last 2 decades many instances of where the creation of the single market or Schengen, even if we didn't join the Schengen zone, the single currency, where actually EU member states have got closer, and the UK has been and was throughout that either respectfully saying we don't want to join Schengen, we don't want to join the single market, or in other cases we don't want to join the single currency, or in other cases we've been a loyal, committed and enthusiastic supporter, whether about EU enlargement, whether about the extension of the single market, etc. But once the decision had been taken to leave, our ministers have been very clear that we needed to do that, and we needed to deliver on it for British voters in the way that they had set out. And Prime Minister Johnson received a significant electoral mandate in December 2019 from the British people on the basis of, forgive the phrase, getting Brexit done. Now, because of those complexities and the Northern Ireland issue, as I think Michel Barnier's stance and the Commission's stance at the outset recognised when it said, for the withdrawal agreement, we need to resolve the issues of finance, citizens' rights and Northern Ireland. It acknowledged that that was going to be a particularly challenging question because of being the only land border between the European Union and the United Kingdom once we had left. And indeed, it has proved to be just that. But let me just address the 3 points that you raised as examples. I'll come back to Northern Ireland in a second. On France and AUKUS, as I said to Professor Botsiou just now, there was no intention. And I think I would challenge respectfully the idea that the AUKUS decision was in any way a snub for France. The AUKUS decision was a conscious move by the government of Australia, who decided it had a requirement to address a strategic threat, and it wanted to find the partners to help it deliver on that requirement. That is the ultimate driver behind the Australian government's decision to leave one contract and to step into a new partnership on the other. But that's for Australia and France. It's not really for me to comment on. On fishing licenses, all I would say is that the British government's been very clear. We set out, and it was set out in the terms of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, what the rules were and the entitlements would be for those French, Dutch, Belgian, other European national fishermen and vessels who had historically fished in British waters, what the rules would be to enable them to continue to do that. And it set out very clearly. And 98% of those who've applied for licenses have received them. And that's some 1,700, 1,800 or so vessels. We're actually talking about a tiny number of vessels, and it has been given, or it is assumed, an importance, I think, way out of proportion. Now, I'm not downplaying the importance for those crews, those communities across northern France. But I think that is an illustration of what is essentially a bilateral issue, but it shouldn't even really be that, because the rules were set out and we've been very clear. If the evidence is provided, then we have no problem in issuing the licenses. And I think we have a very strong story to tell there. On Northern Ireland, sorry, my answer is a bit long, but on Northern Ireland, well, whatever the situation that has led us to where we are now, the government's motivation, the British government's motivation, is driven by a very clear recognition that the provisions of the current protocol are fueling and enhancing tensions within the community in Northern Ireland. And they are providing an impediment between trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland that was, I think, never intended as part of the original agreement, and which, from our perspective, is disproportionate to the threat to the single market and the integrity of the single market that it was designed from a European point of view to protect or to prevent. So this is what is driving the discussions between Lord Frost and Commissioner Šefčovič. I don't think I'm breaching any confidences if I say that it was an issue that our respective prime ministers talked about last week. It is something where my prime minister and ministers in my government are determined that they need to address, because of the overriding responsibility to ensure that there is a single market for trade within the United Kingdom, but arguably, as if not more important, to avoid inflaming tensions between communities in a part of the United Kingdom that was racked for 3 decades and more by internal strife. And they're seeking to find a way to work with the European Commission to understand those European concerns, but to adjust what was there in order to manage that. Now, I'm not an expert on the details, but I don't think it's intended to be aggressive or uncompromising. And it's not certainly intended to suggest any disregard, and certainly not any disdain. What it is, and it may not always be comfortable or popular, is a government that is clear about its responsibilities and is unapologetic about standing up for its national interests, but wants to discuss those and promote those or pursue those in as constructive and positive a way as possible. I hope I've gone some way to answer your question.
Ambassador, if you would allow me to press you further on this point, your points about the substance of the issues are exceptionally clear, solid, and possibly cogent. My problem is not with the substance of its particular issue, but with the way in which the issues are hyped up and turned into a visually and conspicuously calculated attack on Europe. Let me put it this way. For a country like Greece, European integration is not a merely transactional or purely economic issue. It's an existential matter. It is the guarantee of our security at the most basic economic and strategic level. So from our side of the channel, Europe does not seem as a straitjacket, and I appreciate that for the majority of the UK people, things look differently, and I have no objection to that. Nonetheless, I have to make one point about Northern Ireland and to ask you one question about the framing of the issues from the UK's perspective. If what you say about Northern Ireland is correct, and it possibly is, one still needs to explain the following statement. The protocol, the Northern Ireland Protocol, this protocol that was signed a year ago, ensures for those living and working alongside the Northern-Southern Irish border that there will be no visible or practical changes to their lives, that they can carry on as before. These are not my words. These are the words of your Prime Minister when he signed the treaty. So he thought that it is a perfectly viable treaty, and now you are telling us that it was not so. And one asks oneself, maybe he already knew that he does not like the deal that he signed. He signed the deal, and now he's reneging on it. And of course, everybody knows that pacta sunt servanda, but let me not press this point. My question would have to do with the style, not with the substance. We observe every day, we feel puzzled, we feel aggrieved when we observe every day how EU bashing has become a stock of trade of significant parts of the UK press, of significant parts of the UK political personnel. It is as if it has become a trope of internal political rhetoric to say a nasty thing about Europe, how useless it is, to display schadenfreude whenever something goes wrong in Europe, etc. Where does this leave, again, your soft power and your ability to engage? Don't you feel that people at the other side of the channel listening to this continuous and some often highly offensive derogatory comments, this changes things significantly, permanently? Now you'll tell me if this is the popular press, these are some politicians, this is not the official state. But still, it is as if there is some convergence, some common joint effort to project this negativity, this hostility.
Thank you, Professor. I mean, let me try and answer in two parts. I'm going to start by saying it's not meant to sound flippant, but I certainly hope it isn't going to be permanent in its effects, because my job is to make sure that, as a diplomat, that actually our soft power and our relationships are able to grow and flourish. You're right, I will, and I think legitimately, point the finger a little bit at the popular media, which I think governments across the world, including in liberal democracies, often have a relationship with the media, and they use it occasionally to help reinforce their messages or whatever. But that is part of the cut and thrust and back and forth that we have, and I personally treasure in a free democratic society where people can speak and speak their minds. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment on the party politics, but I would say that I think it is quite telling that the journey that the United Kingdom went on to make a reality of that referendum vote to leave the European Union took a long time and was difficult. And you have in that government and that parliamentary majority that Prime Minister Johnson and the Conservative Party have at the moment, you have certainly a government that is single-minded in its responsibility to pursue and deliver Brexit and then make a success of it. If some of that means that occasionally, perhaps too often, the media is engaging in attacks, in language that is more aggressive and confrontational than it would otherwise be. Well, I don't think that's uniquely on the other side of the channel in the United Kingdom. It does happen elsewhere. All I would say is that I think it places a responsibility on those of us like myself who are instinctively internationalists, who see a clear set of instructions from a prime minister who has a very internationalist perspective, and a government that is pursuing, and I talked about the integrated review, a bold and confident plan. And you can argue whether you like the Global Britain label or not, but it needs to be framed in terms of the positive and what we're aiming to achieve and how we can do that in partnership. And we need, I hope, as quickly as we can, to move beyond the sort of cheap attacks and unconstructive language, which you're right to point out has been perhaps occasionally too present in certain parts of the media. But my final point would be to say, and this is particularly true in France, where I spent the last 4 years, and where the UK and France have not only a close relationship, but an inextricable bond, if you like, through geography and proximity and so on. It's very interesting, whilst the politics and the media may be in a certain place, to recognize that as sovereign nation states, whether European Union members or not, what ties us, and this is also true for the UK and Greece, is much more than the politics and the media debate. It is the human-to-human links, it's the educational connections, it's the business and economic ties, the tourist flows, etc. And that gives me confidence and encouragement for the future, because that is not, people in that space are not busy criticizing each other or whatever. They want to get on and cooperate and work together and enjoy their lives and do things that matter and make a difference. So I'm not going to dispute some of the unfortunate language that comes out in the media, but I don't think it should all be seen through a sort of single prism. And I hope we'll see, as things settle down and the adaptation proceeds, that the general tone becomes more constructive, more positive.
Well, thank you for this complicated answer to a complicated question. This time that Professor Hadjimanil always likes and puzzles us with a lot of questions. Britain has been a school of democracy for European countries for many centuries, actually. And we witnessed the other side of the table of media populism in the past years, where there were a lot of media trying to persuade us that the decision for Brexit was an undemocratic decision. But Britain has also been a school of great power politics. And I think Professor Liakouras would like to take us to that sphere. Professor Liakouras.
Yes, Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for being with us tonight in the Ambassadors Forum. And of course, it is very interesting a discussion with you on these evolutions that happened after the Brexit. But let me take the greater picture of this. Generally, after Brexit, you can give us an idea or a point. What are the main options and orientations of British foreign policy? Will there be a great power policy, or to put it differently, shall we expect that the empire strikes back?
Thank you, Professor. No, I don't think you should expect the empire to strike back, because that would suggest that it's that the government in the United Kingdom stance now is a sort of nostalgic one. I don't think it is at all. I think it is actually driven by what you might call a calculating and confident pursuit of national interest, but recognition, before people jump on me and say, well, that's outrageous and we'll share the planet and so on, recognition that that national interest in the 21st century has to be pursued, promoted and protected in partnership and alliance with others. So if the empire was the ultimate expression of the geographical extension of British influence, soft power, hard power across a large part of the globe, I think what we're seeing now, and I would point you, if I may, to the integrated review document, but we're seeing a British government and an evolution in political and strategic thought in the UK, which recognizes that there are a number of thematic issues which matter to us and matter to our political leaders, but to our citizens, and that perhaps the traditional geographical continental boundaries that we've ascribed previously are not unimportant, but they are less important than they were before. And an obvious one there is our defense and security relationships. There's been media coverage about activity in the near atmosphere and what the Russian Federation or what China is doing of late. We talked with Professor Botsiou about the AUKUS agreement, and I sought to explain how that was complementary to existing and the bedrock of UK national security and defence, namely the NATO alliance, but also to point out that just because we've left the European Union, the United Kingdom is not opposed to stronger defence partnership and cooperation amongst European Union member states, for example. So defence and national security is one thing, where the threats are now global. The challenge of science and technology. I mean, let's look at where we are with the COVID pandemic. At the beginning, back in February, March last year, I don't think we ever imagined that we would still be in this situation now in November 2021. Neither did we actually, I think, imagine, if I get my dates right, in November 21 that in November 20, so 12 months ago, that we would be looking back on the successful development, not only of one COVID vaccine, but multiple COVID vaccines, and the rolling out of those vaccines to greater or lesser effect across certainly much of the developed world, and too slowly, but increasingly across the developing world. So again, that's another illustration of how Britain sees the contribution that it can make through our institutions, through our researchers, through our national science capability, but almost always in partnership with others. And climate is perhaps the other thing that I would point to. There was much criticism is perhaps not the right word, but anticipation in the run-up to the Glasgow talks about whether the UK, working with Italy, was going to manage to make a success of it. Now, it isn't as successful as we might have hoped, in that we haven't got a here and now immediate commitment which will keep us to 1.5 degrees, and we didn't, most famously at the end, and Alok Sharma, as the president, was very clear about this, get a number of key players, whether it's India, whether it's China, to sign up to the phasing out of coal. But look at the example, a really positive example of Greece with a commitment to phasing out lignite burning. Look at the international coordination that actually has left us, as we look back now at the talks that finished last week, with not only the prospect still that 1.5 can be within reach, but actually a commitment as we go through the next year and hand over to Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh in November next year, a commitment to annual review that we didn't have when we made the Paris Agreement talks, and which will, it will keep the pressure on. So I hope, whether it's on climate, whether it's on science and technology, whether it's on defense and security, there's a clear sense that this isn't about British imperial nostalgia. This is about a United Kingdom that has and has always had, certainly for the last 200 years or so, a set of global horizons. Other pressures have meant that our attention may have been more drawn towards Europe or our near neighborhood at various points. But a clear decision and a confident setting out from our government now of the role we want to play in that global context. with our European partners, particularly recognizing the pace at which the new economies in the Indo-Pacific region are growing, and how it is going to be important for us not only to protect and nurture our near neighborly friendships with our European partners, but also to make sure that we're working still with the United States, with Australia, with others like Vietnam or whatever. So that's the vision, and it's based on theme and a recognition, I think, of the global environment that we are looking towards.
Now, allow me to move from the global level to the regional or bilateral level. Usually in British-Greek relations, the elephant in the room has been the Cyprus question and related issues. And Professor Liakouras, as we all know, is an expert in the Cyprus issue. But before giving the word to Petros, I would like to move to Professor Yannis Tivachtis, who has another related question to the Cyprus issue. And then I will move further to Petros for his own positioning on the subject. Professor Tivachtis.
Yes, thank you very much. Mr. Ambassador, I'd like to thank you for your opening remarks. And before I pose my question, I would like to wish you great success in your new position. When everybody discusses about exclusive economic zone in Eastern Mediterranean, we speak about Greece, Turkey, Republic of Cyprus, Syria, Libya, Egypt, Israel, Lebanon. But usually we don't think about another country that has territories in that part of the world, and this is the United Kingdom. So I would like to start my question by pointing out that following the signature of the London-Zurich agreements that created the Republic of Cyprus, the United Kingdom declared its intention not to claim territorial waters adjacent to the sovereign military bases on the island of Cyprus. But given the evolving situation in the Eastern Mediterranean, would the British government continue this policy? But also I'd like to add a second question. Would the British government consider claiming an exclusive economic zone in that area?
Thank you, Professor. And this is an issue that I will tread carefully on. So I'm glad I'm speaking in English for the first point. And I'll do my best to do justice to your question. I think the first point, and I hope it is consistent with what I was just saying to in response to the previous question. Insofar as an exclusive economic zone is a prosperity asset, it is also a manifestation, I realize, of sovereignty and so on. But insofar as it is an issue which preoccupies states about the resources that they have within that, I think it's important to understand that the UK's engagement with Cyprus and our presence there is both one of historical responsibility, but it's also through the sovereign base areas an expression of and an element of UK contribution, we hope and believe, to regional and global peace and stability. So there is not an economic driver for the United Kingdom with our engagement in Cyprus. It's also, I think, notable that, and you'll know this better than I do, I think, but in the 2004 law that the Republic of Cyprus passed and was notified to the UN declaring that exclusive economic zone extending 200 nautical miles from the 1993 baselines, the UK did not lodge any objection to that declaration. There was no issue. And I don't think there's any intention, any suggestion, let alone intention, suggestion that we would do that, because it is not, I think, consistent with our presence in Cyprus and why we are there. And I used the word advisedly at the beginning when I talked about responsibility. And I think we might come on to the wider Cyprus settlement issues. But I think it is, it's important that we do recognize and do what we can to fulfill those responsibilities, because we would argue, even if we're in the northwestern corner of the European continent, and Greece is here in the heart of the southeastern corner, that we all have an interest. And I would be so bold as to suggest this extends even to the Turkish government in Ankara, but others along in the Levant and the North African coast. We all have an interest in the Eastern Mediterranean being able to be a zone of prosperity and stability. And it was something that Minister Zendias, I remember, said to the Foreign Secretary when they met at the end of October. And so it is that is driving us in this, rather than any narrower sort of economic interest or whatever. And so I don't anticipate any change on that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Professor Liakouras, the settlement issue was raised. I suppose you have to ask something about that.
Yes, turning around again the Cyprus question and about solution and about the day after. During the Geneva informal meeting of April 2021 on the Cyprus question and the viable solution, let's say, there was no signal of reaching a possible compromise, given the Turkish and Turkish Cypriot position towards a two-state solution, which was an impasse for the Cyprus, the process of getting a solution about this, a settlement actually. Would we expect, because British United Kingdom had an active role, I can say, about this, but would we expect the British insistence and engagement still on an active role in the forthcoming conference or conferences, and how this can be formed in order to reach a viable compromise, aligned though with the UN Security Council resolutions? We all know what the UN Security Council resolutions say, and of course these are adopted by the 5 permanent members, including UK. So you know about this, and of course we know about what we say about this.
Thank you, Professor. I think the key point is that from a UK perspective, it was our former Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab who represented the United Kingdom there in the meeting you referred to in April this year. And at that meeting, he was very clear in terms of urging all sides to demonstrate the flexibility and compromise necessary to find a solution to the Cyprus problem within UN Security Council parameters. And the British government's fundamental position on that has not changed. It is a matter of sadness and regret to us that at the end of those talks, for reasons that you indicate, the Secretary General concluded that they hadn't found enough common ground to allow for the resumption of formal negotiations. Now, to an extent, that's where we still are in practical terms. And as you all know as well as I do, there continues to be a debate between the UN and the Greek Cypriot community, the Republic of Cyprus, and the Turkish Cypriots in the north about an envoy and whether it's a special envoy or personal envoy. I think from our point of view, and I say this with a certain amount of feeling, having been at the team who went to Bergenstock in 2004, and having been here in Athens a few years before that, but also having worked in the European institutions for a period, it is, what's that diplomatic word? It is highly regrettable that we still find ourselves unable to move forward on the basis of those Security Council resolutions, and on the basis, as the wide international community supports, of a bizonal, bicommunal federation with political equality. That is still the UK government's position. We believe it not only because we believe it's right, but we also think it is the most equitable and sustainable solution. And we're obviously frustrated and worried when we see language and movements in Varosha, where we see a polarization again between the leaders of the communities in advance of elections, presidential elections in Cyprus, this is, it's not what any of us would want. The UK, and I could quote directly from my Prime Minister, the UK stands ready to provide whatever support it can to the United Nations and to the parties and to the other guarantor powers, and this was in the context of his meeting with Prime Minister Mitsotakis, to support the resumption of negotiations in order to achieve that bizonal, bicommunal federation with political equality. That's much easier said than done, sadly. But our support is there. This is not about profiling the UK. It is about whether we can, through the Security Council, through our rider relationships, whether we can work in a way that helps the UN deliver this.
Mr. Ambassador, before moving to a totally different issue, I think Professor Styvartis would like to ask a question in the same argument.
Yes, Mr. Ambassador, it seems to me that following the departure from the European Union, the United Kingdom is developing a new strategy for the Eastern Mediterranean region. I have three short questions pertaining to this issue. My first question is, what is the end goal of this strategy? Second, what is the place of Greece and Cyprus in this strategy? And third, where the goals of this British strategy are compatible or in competition with those of France?
I'm tempted to answer your question in reverse, but let me address. I mean, I think the truth of the matter is that we are still in this early stage. It's not yet quite 12 months since we finally left the European Union. We are still working through a number of the adaptational and transitional issues. The integrated review that I referred to, I'm very happy to share a link to it if you haven't had the chance to see it before, provides a very clear strategic roadmap for the United Kingdom's interests across the globe. And there are references, of course, there to stability and security in the European neighborhood, to countering threats of all sorts, which include the threat of radicalization or terrorism emanating from failed states and conflict zones and so on. So that is the broad framework. The recently appointed Foreign Secretary, as I said earlier, has set out her own vision about this sort of network of liberty and working to develop security and economic ties to reinforce democratic, free trading states. And there's a clear part for the UK with Greece, with the Republic of Cyprus, with others, with Israel in the Eastern Mediterranean in doing just that. But we don't have yet a detailed regional strategy for the Eastern Mediterranean. What we do have, again, is this strategic bilateral framework that we've just signed with Greece, and we have existing bilateral partnerships that are complex and diverse and varied in their own ways, of course, with the Republic of Cyprus, with Israel, with Jordan. The relationship with Egypt is improving significantly. And we also have, and it's I know always a slightly sensitive issue here in Greece, we have a broadly positive and constructive relationship with Turkey, because from a British government's point of view, and this is true of different parties and different prime ministers over certainly the 2.5 decades I've been a diplomat, there is a very clear recognition of the importance of embracing a secular, democratic, Western-orientated Turkey to the European and the Western vision, and not allowing forces within that country to take it in a different direction in a way that would pose, and has already, you could argue, can point to the migratory challenges of the last 5 years. And I know that Greece bilaterally has others through, whether it's Mavivatan or whatever, the bilateral differences. But our approach has been one of sort of constructive engagement with Ankara, with a view to trying to embrace and to influence that way. Now, I am, and it may not be obvious on the tin or whatever, but I am instinctively quite Francophile. I had a wonderful 4 years in France that reminded me of quite what it is that connects the UK and France. There's very little outside the purely commercial space. There's very little where I would say the UK is directly in competition with France. Almost nothing, actually. Now, that's not to say that there aren't differences, and those differences will become more evident at certain times in political cycles, etc. And of course, a bit like Professor Haji Emmanuel said of Greece earlier on, you know, European Union membership for Greece has become a sort of existential issue. European Union membership for President Macron and his government in France is a very conscious choice about the strategic direction in which they believe France should go. Now, we'll see where the presidential elections lead, and there's a lively debate there, as there is in all of our countries, on these sort of issues. The United Kingdom chose to go in a different direction. But as I tried to say, and I hope I'm managing to reassure you, that different direction doesn't mean, and whether it's for the UK-France relationship or the wider UK-European relationship, that we need to be anything other than collaborative partners with a slightly different approach, but partners who fundamentally share the same values, the same interests, and are trying to address the same challenges.
You repeated the phrase network of liberty. So allow me to take you to a network of lacking liberty, migration, which is haunting bilateral relations between Greece and Turkey as well. Professor Lapouras would like to pose a question for this specific issue.
For this hot issue of migration, and actually migration has been the dominant issue in the British campaign and of course during the negotiations for the Brexit process. But Turkey, as is known, holds the key to the massive flows of migrants or immigrants to Europe. Nevertheless, is often protected in the EU. Will the UK introduce new policies on this issue, whereas the revision of the EU policies on migration are not yet visible? Shall we expect a stricter approach to Turkey? Because Turkey, as I said, is the key issue on the massive flows. Because all of this, except with the situation with Lukashenko, but mainly Turkey is the main exit of different migrants or migration for the rest of Europe.
Thank you, Professor. And I mentioned migration in my opening remarks. As an illustration, two of the visits happened before I arrived, but in the last 6 months, we've had 3 separate ministerial visits from the UK Home Office, our Ministry of Interior equivalent, to Greece to see how the Greek government and the Ministry of Asylum and Migration, but also the Coast Guard and others, are dealing with the migration challenge, particularly in the Eastern Aegean and islands like Samos and Leros and so on. There is a very clear meeting of minds between our Home Secretary, Priti Patel, and Mr. Mitsotakis, and a very clear recognition of the enormous pressure and difficulties that Greece has been placed under, and also of the role and responsibility that the Turkish authorities have had in in helping, if that's the right word, in managing that. I'm not going to go back to the 2016 agreement. All I would say, and if you met him the other month, if my colleague in Ankara was sat here talking to you, he would say, well, yes, but it's important to recognize that Turkey, I think, is hosting currently somewhere in the region of 5 million illegal, unregistered refugees or migrants. They are the ones who, in many ways, bear the most immediate challenge of migration, whether it's from Syria or Iraq or most recently from Afghanistan. So it is not as if the Turkish government is not facing its own challenges on this. But I think the key point from our perspective is we want to learn from what the Greek government has done very successfully over the last 18, 24 months. When you said, in many ways, the challenges are greatest now for the government in Poland with what, to all intents and purposes, looks like the instrumentalization of migration flows being pushed from Belarus into Poland or into Lithuania. And the UK has sent resources to help the Polish government try and strengthen its frontiers there. And there is a very positive relationship between London and Warsaw, but also between London and Athens and the Greek government on these issues. Now, if I then step back a bit, one of the reasons why there is so much focus, of course, in the UK is because we are confronting in a slightly different way, but an ongoing migration crisis across the English Channel. And aside from Brexit, this was the single biggest issue that dominated my 4 years in Paris. Now that we have stepped outside of the European Union, now that we're outside of the Dublin framework, we recognize that there will need to be new agreements with our European partners, for us most obviously with France, about particularly the issue of returns and readmissions. That's work in progress. But I think the key point is that we are, as the UK, we're standing shoulder to shoulder with Greece. And whilst we were still a member state, we had a UK border force cutter operating in the Aegean as well. And we will continue to do that. Whether that means it's a stricter approach to Turkey specifically, I think what I'd prefer to say as a diplomat is the ruthless focus from our ministers is on combating the smugglers and the organized criminal gangs, wherever they may come from, whatever nationalities. And in order to do that, we need to work with national authorities. And we do that to greater or better or lesser effect in France. We do so in a rather different way here with the Greek authorities. And we're starting to do so increasingly with the authorities in Poland and Lithuania. So I hope there's a clear recognition that the UK is not just sort of distancing itself from this migration challenge, because we're experiencing the effects of it ourselves. Hope that answers your question.
It's a very hot issue for the Greek public opinion, and it definitely needs international cooperation to be dealt with. We cannot do otherwise. Professor Stevachtis informs me that you'd like to pose his question, and then we have a final one by Professor Hadjimanuil. And thank you very much for the complete answers that you're giving us until now.
If my answers are too long, then feel free to cut me off, that's fine.
We'll have to study them again and again. Professor Stevachtis.
Mr. Ambassador, according to the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, the framework agreement that was recently signed by Greece and the United Kingdom builds on strong security and defense cooperation as both countries seek to challenge malign actors that threaten to disrupt our freedoms and way of life. According to analysts, this framework agreement will enable individual deals to be done across a range of sectors, including foreign policy, defense, and maritime affairs. Are there indications at that stage? Of what kind of shape and form would such cooperation in defense, foreign policy, and maritime affairs would take?
Thank you. I'll try and answer succinctly. On the defence side, I think it is fair to say that we are not currently envisaging a UK-Greece mutual defence and cooperation arrangement like Greece has successfully signed recently with the United States of America, nor indeed the strategic partnership agreement with France. But we are working up what we're calling in sort of diplomatic, bureaucratic speak, a joint vision statement. We are hugely aware of the existing ongoing cooperation and partnership between the Hellenic Armed Forces and UK Armed Forces. It hasn't proved possible with other pressures, but many Greeks may not have noticed, but we've had the carrier strike group that's headed out to the Indo-Pacific and is just now back in the Mediterranean heading home. Much of that transit through the Eastern Mediterranean and onwards was made possible by the support that the Greek authorities have provided through Souda Bay and Crete. The very unfortunate accident you may have heard about a few days ago where the aircraft ditched into the sea again, getting the accident investigation people out, evacuating the pilot. We couldn't do any of that without the support that that Greece provides to us in Crete and in Souda, and that's hugely recognized. But also, whether it's the annual training visits that the Red Arrows come to Greece to do, whether it's wider partnership. I know we had HMS Kent in Piraeus back in June. There was a whole series of military defense and cooperation activity that goes on, much of it below the radar, but is enormously valued and appreciated. And one of the things that Minister Zendias and the Foreign Secretary talked about was the scope for doing more naval exercising together. On foreign policy, well, I mean, there are certain issues, and we've touched on them this evening, whether it's the Cyprus problem, whether it's Greek-Turkish tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean, whether it is the wider regional security issues, where the UK and Greece, I hope and believe, will always be talking to each other and pursuing opportunities to work together and collaborate. That also extends into the Balkans increasingly now. And I think as I look and I notice the new partnerships that Greece is striking up with Egypt, with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, certainly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, two countries who the UK got a very close relationship with, but also Israel. I think there's real potential there for us doing more together. And then finally, on the maritime affairs, I mean, I was in the Marine Club in Piraeus yesterday talking to many of the shipbuilding community. That's an interesting one because for them, London and access to UK maritime services and so on is a key part of the business model that they've had for many, many years. And hosting the International Maritime Organization, hosting many genuinely global shipping operations. We're keen to nurture and protect that and help it grow. So that is going to be a key focus for me over the future. It's interesting that much of that, 20 plus 24% of global tonnage that is Greek owned is flagged under other flags. And so people skimming this don't necessarily appreciate the extent of Greek influence over the global shipping, nor perhaps do they recognize that it counts for some 90% of global trade. So I think we're very clear-eyed about how important it is and what Greece's strength and influence is there. So we want to work with Greece.
Thank you. Great. Thank you very much.
We've talked about Britain as a school of democracy, as a school of great power politics, as a school of maritime trade, and now as a school of education. And Professor Hadjimanuil needs to ask this question in his analytical terms that will make it even more complex and pressing. Professor Hadjimanuil.
Ambassador, speaking of business models, I have asked to have the final question in order to address not an issue of international politics or international relations, but one about human relations and prospects and the links between our country and the UK. So you mentioned the maritime business model, the shipping industry, but then again, we have the issue of the tertiary education and research activities, which are of great interest to Greek families, to Greek students, to the Greek economy, to everybody in this country. So the UK is a leading exporter of educational services. The university sector has boomed in recent decades. It has boomed with the help of a huge influx of European students. But now this model is under threat. And I'm thinking of three shifts or changes, in particular structural changes. The first has to do with the explosion of tuition fees, which have gone up, well, 200% for Greek students and other Europeans. We do not longer qualify as home students. We pay international fees. This will definitely have an impact. But then again, there is the question of the inability of future generations of European students, including Greeks, to stay and work in the UK after completing their studies, which is a disadvantage. Why should you pay so much in order to be forced out of the prospective labor market? And finally, but it's the least visible but not the least important aspect, I know that the UK is making huge efforts to remain part of Horizon, the research and development European funding program. I have no doubt that it will remain a member, but still the EU is bound to pursue its own interests by onshoring a significant part of research and development activities, which now take place on the basis of consortia led by UK institutions. The three factors, to my mind, threaten the business model of UK universities and research institutions. How do you see the situation developing?
Thank you, Professor. I mean, this, and without exaggeration, because we've covered a lot of issues over the last hour or so, but this, I think, is the one issue that has been most quickly brought to my attention and has been most consistently raised since I was in Thessaloniki in July at the university doing some language lessons and met a number of professorial colleagues, all of whom raised this. And it is a real issue. I'm not going to pretend it's not. I think the government, our ministers, would say two things in response. And forgive me if this sounds a bit sort of direct, because I've challenged them on the issue. The first thing is they'd say they now have a new immigration system that is nationality blind. Why do I mention that? Well, okay, students now from the European Union wanting to study in the UK need to go down a visa route. Before we talk about the issues of fees, they need to go apply for a visa. But that nationality blind comment and the truth underpinning it is, I think, a good illustration of the approach that our ministers unapologetically are taking, which is to say they are not persuaded that it is appropriate or necessary, now that the United Kingdom has left the European Union, that there should be a separate and bespoke set of arrangements for students from the European Union. Students from the European Union are very welcome. but they will come alongside students from the Commonwealth or from Asia or elsewhere. So that's part of the sort of the mentality that has informed that of the change. Yes, along with my colleagues, British ambassadors, high commissioners across Europe, we are already seeing the impact of stepping out of Erasmus Plus and the end of home fee status. We haven't had the final figures in this year, but for the undergraduate entry in September 21, so 2 months ago, it looks as though numbers are probably 60% down on where they were before. So we're only 40% this year. And as a diplomat interested in relations between the United Kingdom and Greece, I can't help but be worried about that. Not because the universities actually seem to be remarkably confident and upbeat in the UK. They're confident because the best of them know that they're world beating and they have an offer that will continue to be attractive even if the costs have gone up. Others know that they're high quality, they still have a good reputation. And this year, at least, even if they have got fewer students from Europe, they've managed to fill the gap either with increased demand from domestic students or from students from other parts of the world. So they're not immediately saying to government, this is a problem that we're concerned about. But we do need to address the impact of higher fees, the fact that we've got staff here who may have a Greek parent and a British parent whose child is now studying in the Netherlands because they can study in English and do it here. And I'd say to the Greek system, if you can roll out English language courses, then enter the competition of the market doing that. So we're not in any way complacent about that, but we will locally do, and we are doing everything we can to support those students who still want to go through increased and expanded scholarship programs, and also through the strengthening of reciprocal arrangements. We have a Turing program, which is not the same as Erasmus. It's just about sending British students to overseas, but where there is a working assumption that universities will find reciprocal arrangements to enable them to send students to the United Kingdom. So the numbers will not be the same. And I think my successor in 10, 15, 20 years' time will notice the impact of that. And that is something that saddens me. But we've therefore got to work doubly hard to try and bolster those numbers. The last point, and it's maybe not the last point I should finish on, but that's how it's ended up. On Horizon, you asked a very good question earlier on, Professor, about whether you thought the British government was being unnecessarily confrontational or aggressive and showing disdain or whatever. All I would say is that the British government, from prior to the finalisation of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, has been very clear, even if we wanted to step out of Erasmus Plus, and we have done, that we wanted to remain within the Horizon Agreement. We are still waiting for that Horizon Association Agreement to be signed. From London, there is no understanding about why there is a delay, and therefore the assumption is the delay is somehow to provide some additional political leverage because of disagreements about fish or Northern Ireland. I think that is regrettable. I think that is regrettable for European cooperation on research and development. And I also think it's regrettable because actually the UK and the size of the UK economy, the diversity of our economy, and the skills in that mean that we have a lot to offer. And I would like to see, from a non-political standpoint, I'd like to see research and development cooperation continue, even if we're now as an associate member outside the European Union. But let's see where the politics end up on that.
Well, I hope we will end this discussion with a less melancholic note, since this issue concerns us all, panelists and audience, as professors and parents. And we hope that the issue of tertiary education will be settled in the not so far future between the two countries. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for this wonderful discussion. You've been so patient in order to answer to all our questions, and there were complex questions, I have to say. Thank you very much for giving us your time, and the best to deliver. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. I would also like to thank the distinguished professors of the panel, Professor Hadjimanuil, Professor Liakouras, Professor Styvartis. And let me also say many thanks to our audience who has been with us tonight and is a source of inspiration for further such discussions. Again, thank you very much, and I hope we will have again the discussion or another discussion with you when you have been for a longer time period in Greece and you have discerned all the differences that have taken place in the country in the past 20 years. Καλό βράδυ.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All the best.